Hey everyone, it's EJ from iDesign.com, and I got a really cool tutorial for you today. Gonna go through it really quick on how to get a really nice illustrative look to your 3D objects in Cinema 4D. So you see right now you can get a really flat look by just loading up uh, colors in your luminance channels, giving 100% luminous, uh, and you render that and it's nice and flat. But what if you want to give it some depth? If you want to add some shadows or something like that? So what you normally do is just go in, create a light here. Let's bring it out in space, maybe a little bit up to the upper left here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and turn on just a ray traced hard shadow, and I'll render that. And you'll see nothing's happening, and that's because we can't have shadows go onto materials that have 100% luminance because it's got 100% luminance. So the one thing we're going to use to get really nice shading on our 2D shading on our 3D objects is by, I'm just going to go into this gray material here that I have applied to this anchor element here. You can see this is a fully 3D object here. I'm going to go in and I'm going to go and grab our cell shader here. Now a cell shader is really handy. What I'm going to do now is go and enable our interactive render region so we can see live what's going on. And you can see that we have the cell shader, and what it's doing is through its diffuse channel here, it's coloring and shading our object, and it's doing it based on the camera being its light source. So by default it's set to camera. I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to use lights. So our light in our scene is now the one that's going to be driving all of these channels in our cell shader, and you can see that it's now being cast. All these diffuse layers or color shades are being driven by our light in our scene that's up in the upper left here. So I don't want blue. I'm just gonna use a two-tone color here, and for this I'm gonna use like a very kind of blue greenish kind of color here, and then I'm just going to get rid of that chiclet, make another chiclet off of our color we just chose, and I'm just going to make this a little bit darker, right? So that looks good, and then move that down, and you can see that by moving our chiclets around is driving the threshold of these colors being cast in our diffuse option in our cell shader here. So you can have it just a very nice sliver of that second diffuse color or a lot more. So I'm going to leave it right about here. I think I'm liking that, how that's getting shaded right now. So another step further is we can go ahead and add specular and enable that. You can see we have these nice specular highlights. Again, I'm just going to use a two-tone kind of specular highlight, and whatever's black, specular is not going to show up at all. But whatever's white or light gray or whatever value of gray that's other than black, think of it as this specular gradient, or the specular channels being add like a blending mode, like screen or something like that. So I can go ahead and change this color. Let's make it something very obvious to this, reddish. And what it is, it's just going to get screened over this diffuse. So I'm just going to choose just pure white. And you can see that that's being screened on top of our diffuse. We can also enable shadows as well. And you can see now shadows can be cast onto our anchor element here by enabling that shadow. And also going to just make this two-tone. And the nice thing about this shadow is, say, that just kind of shaded everything. Let's go ahead and let's not make that so dark. We'll make this white. So that was shading pretty much everything because of the darker gray values. But you can see I can make the shadow darker, and you can actually change the shadows, the shadow mode. Right now it's set to multiplied by default. You can change it to just a color shadow or just use the light shadow color. But I'm just going to leave it at multiply, and you can change different modes. So you can actually use it to the hue of the shadow, the saturation, or the value. And I'm just going to use the value because then it's going to, again, it's going to get like kind of multiplied using the same values of the color values of our diffuse. So if I make this a little bit gray, this is now going to be like just a darker overlay shadowed element that's using our diffuse color and just kind of darkening it. And you can see that if it's just normal, we're kind of losing definition there. So I'm going to go back to hue or value, sorry, and then we're going to actually see that shadow nice and defined way better there. All right, so again, you can change the threshold of the specular. So that looks good. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to copy this channel over, and I'm going to use it to help me shade the orange bits that are back here on our lifesaver. I'm just going to hit paste, and you can see that applied the same kind of shading that was on our anchor here. But I'm going to go ahead, and the one thing I'm going to do is move our diffuse a little bit more so you just see the edge of our diffuse kind of shading here, and maybe bring our specular just up a little bit just so it's a little bit more subtle. And then what I'm going to do is go to filter, and I can colorize this. Instead of having to go in and change all the colors manually in our diffuse, I can just use a filter and adjust the saturation, adjust the hue here. And get some kind of nice yellowish, reddish color. Maybe darken this entirely. So cool, I'm liking that color, and that's using just a filter, so you can again interactively choose which color you want, and instead of having to change both these colors in our diffuse, or if you have a different shading, everything like that, you don't have to do that. You can just change it with the hue value here. So that's really useful, and I think that's good. That's a good color. Again, I think I want to go ahead and let's do the same thing. Actually, no. Let's go ahead and go into our white color here. And I'm going to go and just create a fresh new cell shader here and get rid of the colors. So I'm just going to make this white and gray. Let's see this update. So you see we have this nice shading on our lifesaver here. It's a little bit too dark of a gray. I'm going to just bring that up a little bit, just nice and subtle. And then I'm going to allow shadows to be cast on. You can see that activates our shadows. And I don't want, let's do the same thing where I'm going to use value. And let's see. Let's make this, whoop, created a new chiclet, didn't mean to. Let's make that a little bit lighter. Cool, so it's just darkening it just a little bit there. And let's just move this in just a tad bit more. Cool, so I'm liking that. So that's our white texture. And let's see, now we got to move on to our ribbon here. So let's go into our yellow. And let's go ahead and let's copy and paste our white cell shader so we can start from that. And let's give this some nice kind of tannish color. Just gonna make a new chiclet based off that color I just selected and just make it a little bit lighter. Cool, that looks good. So you see this nice shading, this nice definition added to our ribbon element. The one thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to turn off camera. And actually, I think in my white cell shader, yep, I left camera on that too. I don't want camera on that. I want to use lights. Yeah, so that's looking, it's looking better. So now we have that light coming from not the camera, but being lit by our light. Cool. That's good. Let's go into our yellow again. And we're going to use the lights for this as well. And actually we'll use camera for this too. So it's going to be lit by our camera and our lights. And we have this back. Let's turn off shadows. Don't need shadows. Let's turn on specular. And for this, I'm going to, so like I said, specular kind of applies or is like a blending mode that screens onto our diffuse color. So we can actually go in and use the same color of our diffuse. If I just magnifying glass that and sample that color, and then sample our brighter color, you can see that that kind of screens onto our original diffuse colors here. You can actually make these a little bit lighter just to add some contrast here. And let's kind of move the specular thresholds down. And you can see that we have the shading on the back as well. And what happens with this, just normal as opposed to, I'm going to describe this back facing element now. Let me turn this on. You can see that our gradient or our diffuse gradient is now applied over the front and back of our material and not just the part that's facing the camera. So with this off, is our whole entire gradient is being applied to the front, and then it's being applied to the back again a separate time. So with back facing on, the entire gradient spans the front and back of our object. So I'm liking this option where it's spanning the front and back. So now we have, I can control the threshold, so the back side of our ribbon is this darker color. Let's make this just a tad bit darker. Cool. So now this has the illusion of like a shadow being cast. You can see that with the shadows actually on, really doesn't do anything. So I'm just going to keep that off. And one more thing for our ribbon is I'm going to add text material. And I created this text material by using a spline shader. And I have a tutorial about the spline shader on the web, and I'll link it to this tutorial. And a spline shader is very useful for just making text as a material in just a shader in Cinema 4D, so you don't have to make it as a Photoshop texture and bring it in. So I just have this ahoy with my little silver fake hipster font, and I'm just going to apply that to the ribbon. Boom, ahoy, and that ribbon element is now done. And again, if you want to find out more about the spline shader to get that text, hit up that tutorial. And let's see, we got to do our ribbon next. So let's go ahead and do that. So right now I have, in the diffusion channel, I have this rope displacement texture. And I'm going to actually link this entire project file in the tutorial description, so you can download it and actually get all these materials and stuff and just play around, tear it apart. But it's in my, I loaded it into my diffusion channel. It's just affecting the luminance because we're just dealing with our luminance here. And let's go ahead, and I'm just going to copy the cell shader from our ribbon. I'm just going to paste that in here. Going to get rid of the camera and the back facing. So now you can see we have this nice shading on our rope. I'm going to enable shadows, so it's also going to accept shadows from the anchor and line up here too. And I'm going to get rid of this little specular highlight. I just want a tiny, tiny specular highlight here. And let's see. Let's get a little bit darker diffusion here. I'm liking that. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, that's good. And the final thing we have to do is, you'll see there's no shadow. So what if we want to cast a shadow on this background here? And this background is just a floor, and I just rotated it up in the Y. And if I move this forward and back, you can see it's placed right behind all of our elements here. And let's go into our luminance here, add another cell shader, and you can see just by default it doesn't look all that great. Gonna give this an, actually let's go ahead and let's grab this orange, and let's just grab this whole entire filter plus cell shader and just paste it just to save us some time. And we can get rid of specular, and good. Now we can go into here and get like a dark bluish color. So let's go about -90 here, and let's see, get this nice dark nautical blue. Bring down the saturation slightly, and that looks cool. And you can see that we have our shadow cast right here. Nice thing about the cell shader, in that it's being driven by our light, is if we change the position of our light, it changes everything in our cell renderer. So we get like completely different looks. If you bring the light really close, you get these more dramatic kind of shadows that are looking, pretty nice. One thing you're seeing here is we're getting this second diffuse material here, and we just want this to be one flat material. Let's brighten that a little bit. Cool. So now it's just going to be a flat color that's accepting shadows. Cool. And we can also go, and if we want, maybe those shadows are a little bit too harsh or too dark, we can lighten that up by giving a lighter gray value in our shadow properties. And so say you really like the shadows being cast on our objects, but this shadow back here on our background not looking so hot. It's very stretched out and deformed. The nice thing about the cell renderer is it has this nice option. If you go in, you can say use lights, and you can actually define the lights that you want to use. So I don't want to use this main light that's lighting everything else in the scene. I'm going to duplicate this, rename this light just the background light, and then I'll say, okay, include this light to cast the shadows on this background texture. So if I go ahead and move my light here, I'm changing the shadow being cast on that background. So you can see that with it back in space, maybe up a little bit. So I can kind of position it where my other light is, so it still looks believable. All the lights and shadows are being cast from the same direction, but the shadow on the background is going to be a little less harsh and not so distorted because we can control it with the second light. So that's cool. I'm liking that, and then I can just do a final render here, and there we go. So using cell shaders in our color channels, or our luminance channels, we can now have luminant flat 2D textures, materials being applied to our objects, and have this nice definition and control everything, how it looks by driving how the diffuse looks, the shadows, everything by the lights in our scene. And one nice little added bonus you can add is a enable the ambient occlusion, and I have the maximum ray length really jacked up here, so we get this nice noise going on our scene. So that's a kind of cool effect as well. So that is it. If you have any questions, hit me in the comments. Again, I'm going to make this file fully available for you so you can download it, pull it apart. But hopefully you can now use the cell shader to create some really cool 2D illustrative animations in Cinema 4D, and then bring it in After Effects and comp all your other 2D flat stuff, and everything looks pretty seamless. So thanks a lot for watching. See you next time.